Cool. All right, let's give it a shot and see what breaks. So if you've been able to access the Discord, can I zoom in here? Nice. Is anyone still, has anyone not been able to find this or needs to get this link somehow? Yeah. What was that? Yeah, so we're going to go to get easy access to Discord, we're going to go to Vue.js.io. So Vue.js.io, and then community, and then Vue.js Discord. And when you click here, you'll just be prompted to create a username. You don't have to create an account. So in here, we're in the TypeScript meetup, and we've got this repository. And what I'd like everyone to do is anyone feel uncomfortable using Git or would prefer a different way to access the code? Is everyone okay cloning? Cool. So we're going to clone this, or if you'd like, you're also welcome to fork it. That would give you the opportunity to then, obviously push your changes to your own repository. First step is we're going to look at the code as it is written right now on the master branch in JavaScript and try to look through some of the basics of how this application is working. And then we're going to do the big scary step, which is Vue CLI provides a way for us to add TypeScript to the project. And then we're going to fix all the things that break. And then we're going to look through some of the methods, what are the things that we'd focus on adding TypeScript to first, what might be a little more challenging. And at any point in this, I'd say just, if I don't see you raising your hand, just interrupt me, especially if we get to a step that you're not, that we've moved on and you're having an issue. Okay. So, let's do a fresh clone of this. And obviously I have a decent amount of this saved as local code and a working TypeScript branch. So if we get to points, or you get to points where you're having difficulty, then I'll point you towards the next step. Okay. Yeah, please. Yeah, keep reminding me of that. I'd appreciate it. Good there? Yeah.
We should add all and do stash.
What was that?
You're around the master branch, you just stash all your changes.
Oh, yeah. I want to make sure that this works and also open myself up to the failure or the potential of it failing. Okay. Okay, so we're going to CD into it. If you've been doing Vue development, I'm assuming you've got Node.js. Anyone have issues with Node or NPM? We'll see when this command works. So in the README, we just mentioned that the first step here is we're going to install the dependencies. And I'm sure lots of you are already well past this. Cool. And then let's just try npm run serve, which is the standard Vue CLI configuration to serve the application. And remember, this is just JavaScript. I created this as a standard standard Vue CLI Hello World app. Cool. Okay, so at least as of right now, things look good. The app that I created, I started with just a basic, but I wanted to make sure that we had some sample API requests to play around with. I happen to spend a lot of time thinking about clean tech and renewables and stuff, so I wanted to find open source API that might be kind of interesting. This is just, I believe it's called NREL. Yep. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and they have a developer network with various open source APIs. What we have here is just a way to search for a city and a state and get emissions data for that city and state and compare against a national average. In this case, it happens to be per capita is what we're displaying. So very basic in terms of the data that displays, but it's all the kind of steps that you'd want for an application, which is we have some repeated components, we have a component tree, we have API calls, And yeah. And if you ever get lost, obviously you have the repo locally, but you can also view it from the About page. Okay, let's take a look at what this code looks like. Cool. So everything we're going to be mostly interested is in source. And the primary thing that I want to focus on here before we do the addition is this home page is primarily just a search component. The search component has a search bar, which is responsible for taking inputs and performing the search. And then the search result chart is responsible for displaying that list of cities. And if you choose to delete one, deleting the city. Things that I ran into while I was building this where I was frustrated that I didn't have TypeScript is I kept forgetting, what does a city actually look like? What are the properties available on it? And at any given time, which version of a city am I using? Am I using the one that comes straight back from the API, or am I using where there's so many extra properties? Or am I using the one that I've modified where it only has the information that I want? Same with emitting events. I would like to know when I'm subscribed to an event, what type of information it's going to provide me, and then I'd like to access that information. At the time of hitting an API, I'd like to know what parameters are going to be required when I use that method. And then even really basic stuff, if you pull up mixins, this is very pure JavaScript, but you forget a lot of times what is the actual type of this thing that I'm going to be accessing. What is total population? I've gotten spoiled over the last 2 months. I'd really like to hover over this and see useful information here, but as you can see, VS Code can only tell us that this is a type of any because we're writing JavaScript. Okay, let's, yeah, any questions about the code? I think there are some parts, obviously it was done not the most bestest way, so there are plenty of issues with it, and I'm sure you can cause some bugs in the application if you're running it. But any questions initially here? Does this mostly look like what you'd expect for a Vue code structure? Not too many issues? Cool. Like I said, just raise your hand, interrupt me whenever. All right, so let's pull up a terminal then. I'm going to go ahead and check out, how about TypeScript attempt? This is just the NPM package. This is the package lock. Okay, so the thing we'll need here, which there's a chance some of you don't have installed, is the Vue CLI, and you need a globally installed version of that. I'd also recommend, because it can change, that we all get this latest version of 3.2.1. So that's a simple npm install at Vue CLI, and if you want at latest, that's kind of optional. So npm install at Vue CLI, install it globally. And I realize some of you, maybe even most, already have this installed. Chris Guerreri gave a great talk on all the things that CLI 3 can do.
I did manage to get it up on the website.
Awesome, yay!
Our YouTube channel.
Nice.
We've got our YouTube channel for these talks.
Very nice. So yeah, would highly encourage people to check that out. There's a lot that Vue CLI 3 can do in terms of customization. We're just going to use one particular Vue core team maintain plugin, which is the TypeScript plugin. Cool. So in our README over here, we have initial setup and then the step to add TypeScript. And this is the main thing, and then we'll break a lot of things. So this is saying use the Vue CLI, add this specific Vue CLI plugin, which is going to handle all the stuff that's defaulting to JavaScript in Vue. It's going to attempt to convert those things to TypeScript, and it's going to get some of those things wrong, and we're going to try to fix those things. Yeah, not a whole lot to say here. People good with that step, the Vue add at Vue/TypeScript, and like I said, it's in your README. Oh no.
I was gonna send this out.
Yeah, throw that in the Discord. That'd be perfect. Okay, so then we get a couple questions. This is the class style syntax that I made mention of. We have two options, the object style or the class style. I'd probably recommend, because we're adding this to an existing project and it'll get a little complex to do the class style. For now, we're going to say no here, so just an N enter. But you're absolutely welcome to make use of that in a future project. And there's, I would say, almost equal documentation on both right now. Then we're going to say yes to using Babel, partly because this project, when it was configured with the CLI, already had Babel in place. And so that's just used for adding polyfills on top of your TypeScript code. TypeScript can compile down to the version of JavaScript that you target, but if there's a specific function that's missing from a browser implementation, like we have, we just ran into today, array.from doesn't work in IE, so you need to make sure that a polyfill is included for that, so that's what Babel does. This type of prompting with the Vue CLI is something that they do super well that that Chris made mention of. And then we're done. We get a list of modified files. We can get diff them, or because we're using VS Code, which is super great, we can view them visually and see some of the things that were changed. And I can tell you right away that one issue with this process is that for the default Vue files, like I still have an app.vue, it's going to try to fix those all to be the default one. So I'm going to lose some of my changes and I have to put those back. Let's see what doesn't work right now. So we're doing npm run build. That TypeScript version conflict is just part of one of the Vue dependencies, and in most cases for minor versions of TypeScript, I would say don't worry about it until you have to. Sometimes you'll get interesting things where you're getting TypeScript errors and you're not expecting to, and that's when you want to check, do my TypeScript versions match what are expected? So we get some initial errors here, and a lot of them you'll see are this implicit has an any type. When I hovered over that constant in my JavaScript file, I saw that it was reading the type as any because it didn't know anything about the type. What TypeScript is saying by default, it doesn't want you to have those scenarios unless you've explicitly told it, okay, I give up. I'm not going to know the type of this, so this type can be any. It wants you to make sure that only in cases where you're intentionally doing that should you be allowing things to have an any type. So the first thing we're going to do, just to give our poor code a chance to compile, is we're going to remove that type of warning at the outset, so that we can come back to it incrementally and fix those issues. So I'm going to pull a developer, and tsconfig is what determines how something compiles, and we want implicit any. Yeah, pull a developer. So this is the no implicit any that we want to make sure gets set here. So if you're following along, this is the tsconfig.json. No implicit any we want to be false for now, so that we can at least get past those types of errors. This is a case of, this is very much a to-do, because it's JSON. I can't really do that legally unless they're going to let me ignore it. To do remove and fix errors, because this is a good rule. What an implicit or an inferred any type is telling you is that we don't know what this is. You haven't told us what this is, so it's going to break. So let's see if we can at least get some different types of errors now.
No explicit?
No implicit. So it's saying implicit is the same as inferred in this case, where I haven't. So let's go here real quick. Const equals anything. So we talked about this with inferred types, because because we've set it up in a spot where TypeScript can infer the type of this thing, it knows that it has to be a string. But there are lots of scenarios where it's from a method or something else where it can't infer the type, and then that's the implicit any. I could say this, and this is the fix, but this is saying I've lost type safety. I don't know what the type of this is going to be. Okay, so it looks like we had a build, which is great news. And I don't think there were any compilation errors. There's a very good chance we're about to run into some lint errors. But this means that we have TypeScript code, and I guess this is something we can probably look at real quick. The changes that were made when we did that add Vue TypeScript looks like... Sorry, I'm missing a step here. Yeah, I guess we'll manually do this. So the yeah, let's leave that alone for now. We have, in our Vue components, we want these to have this lang equals ts to make sure that we can use them in actual TypeScript code within these components, rather than the default JavaScript. You'll also notice, though, that it did take all our pure JavaScript files and it converted those over to TypeScript, meaning I can start to write things like this. Saying that I want this method. So I start adding annotations, for example, in the utilities file. And this is now valid TypeScript because it's a TypeScript file. And that if I were to do something like this, I'll get yelled at because now I'm no longer returning an array. It knows I'm returning I'm no longer returning text. It knows I'm trying to return this array of strings. Okay. Let us. So what I'm going to do. Well, actually, before I do this, so we proved. So before I add these lang equals ts to each file, which will require some adjustments to the imports. We saw that it built successfully. Let's see what happens when we try to serve it. Okay, so it at least got to the point of being able to run the application. So we're going to open it up. And this is not at all what the app had been. This is the issue of, for our default files that previously existed, TypeScript has said, oh, you want to go back to the default for that, right? So we have to explain that no, that's not the case. Intentionally, I have not yet committed any of these changes because just with VS Code and how that works, I want to make sure I still have access to what it was before, because I'm going to copy and paste a few things. So in your own code, let's first go to app.view, and in this split screen view, if you want to do it this way, we're going to copy over the template, leave that the way it was. Okay, cool, no changes to the template now. And we are going to basically revert everything that was done here because it removed the CSS that we had wanted to be there. So we'll copy over the styles as well. Oops. And there we go. Cool. So essentially reverting that entire file because it didn't have any TypeScript associated with it. It didn't have a script tag. Okay, let's see what that looks like now. Okay, cool. So we at least have some of our, in my case it was mostly pure laziness. When you don't want to pick a font, you can just do one of the built-in web fonts that are monospaced and it'll look like you sort of tried. The next thing that we're going to look at is that this home page that we're linking to looks like it doesn't have the content that we wanted to have in it. So now we have our home, yeah, there we go. So this is the first type of change that we're looking for here, where this script tag is now being set to lang equals ts. So it's saying anything inside this script tag, viable TypeScript. Let's again copy over the template because we want that to stay the exact same. Nothing should have changed with your HTML.
You use this add TypeScript thing. There are any options to do, like ignore template?
It's a good question. Not that I know of. I don't think they have anything there. One of the flaws or difficulties from my more limited understanding of the CLI3 is that for each plugin that's created and maintained for CLI3, you have the option to create it with that at least the core maintained ones, with that plugin initially, like when you first create the app. So that plugin has to know what happens when we create a brand new Hello World app, and also when you add it to an existing project. And I think that's some of the difficulty here. Is this is certainly what you would want it to look like when you're first creating the app. But we kind of wish it wouldn't go back over the files if we're still using them. One way to avoid this is just make sure you're not using any of the default file names, and it'll be like, I guess I give up and I can't work with those. But it's not a super realistic solution because we're probably still going to have an app.view. Okay, so what happened here? And this is actually useful. This is actually useful to see what types of changes it decided to make. It did this import view from Vue. That wasn't there before. This line is meaningless because it re-added that and we don't want it there. But this import view from Vue is so that we can use this syntax, which is, at least at the outset, the only thing that needs to change about our Vue code. Instead of export default and a simple object, we do export default view.extend, and this method is what allows Vue to give types to our component. You'll see some information here. It's a little bit confusing. One of my favorite tricks, which I think will work from this view, from this view in VS Code, is F12, or in case there's another command that you might have set, it's the go to definition command, and it opens up just a world of possibilities in TypeScript that you'll find yourself using a lot as you navigate around your code now, because you can jump from method to method to method just wherever your cursor is. F12, see how this is defined. This code is not really meant for us to look at, but this is what Vue has created as a TypeScript addition to the basic Vue to help us give types to our components. So there's all this stuff. This is about as complex as you'll ever see TypeScript get, because Vue is a complicated thing to add types to. But I've had some instances where it has been helpful to go into this. And the only lesson for now is that that's why we have to use this view.extend, so that we're able to keep track of the types of our components. Okay, so I'm gonna, because I want my search component and I don't want I no longer want this hello world. I'm gonna replace that. This is something that we'll have to address. I believe it's just because the tsconfig is not correctly configured to know that this is a Vue file and it's acceptable this way. But we'll come back to that for now and just see if things break. And then that should be about it. I'm going to copy over my styles because those weren't even in the original. And this, I believe, should be sufficient to return this to mostly working order. Yay. All right, so this is now a TypeScript project where we can write TypeScript code. And at least from what I can tell, I'm from Milwaukee. Yeah, working successful network commands. So that's really great. The thing that I'm a little mildly hesitant about is what's going to happen when we try to lint this thing, which you mentioned. Sorry, what was your name?
Taylor.
Taylor. Taylor mentioned that there were packages that didn't seem to work off the bat, and the one that has been the most frustrating is the linting. So we're just going to see what Vue gives us when we try to run its default lint.
I think it's your npm assert fail whenever the lint fails.
What?
Then you really have a hard time.
Yeah. It can be exceedingly painful. Okay, so so far success, but something that we're going to have to be aware of is it looks like it didn't catch some of our component code that already existed, and so we have to make sure that those two get marked as being TypeScript language. Okay, yeah, please.
I might have spaced out when we talked about the shims. Did we talk about the shims?
No,
Okay.
I totally.
Same question.
Thank you. We just don't talk about those.
We don't talk about the shims. Cool.
No, the shims. Yeah, it's a great question. Shims are added because Vue has certain global expectations about what's available when you're running Vue. You have a Vue instance that is available globally. So this the JSX one is actually something that we don't have to worry about, at least as most of us. Does anyone use JSX in their Vue code? I haven't seen it done. I'm sure there's documentation about it. That's what this shim is for, because JSX is this global namespace that you want to have access to. This shim's Vue.d.ts, so a .d.ts file is a definition file for TypeScript, is simply saying, and this is, I think, probably the part that we don't have working yet, is when we import a module that ends in .vue, expect that to have the type of Vue. It's basically saying when I import a file .vue, it's going to be a component. Yeah, go. Oh, sorry.
No.
Gotcha. And so those are the files that it added there. That was a great point. I'm trying to see if there are other brand new files. Probably this tsconfig is the most obvious, which is what Vue uses to compile. What TypeScript uses to compile. And so that's the first thing we did, is this no implicit any. That was the first thing in the tsconfig that we changed. Cool. Yeah, most of the rest of these are looking good. So let me see what happens. I think the step that will potentially break things a little bit, and where we might want to eventually pull down that extra repo, is that the linting right now is using, and I'll try to avoid, because we want to officially ends at 9, but we want to be done by 8:30, right? Was the goal. So I'm gonna start talking about the linting a little bit, but what I want to get into is starting to add types to the code so that we can see it working. The linting right now is using ESLint. It's all covered here in this ESLint config, but what we actually want to do to lint our code is to use TSLint, TypeScript lint, and let's grab that specifically. So if you want to open up the repo here, so we have our add TypeScript to Vue. I'm going to jump over to the cheating branch of add TypeScript part 1. Oops, sorry, not the branch, the pull request add TypeScript part 1. So we're over in pull requests, and I want to grab the tslint file that we created. So it's going to be down here. There we go. Oh, there we go. So tslint.json. Just going to grab this. Cool. So that's the file that is not created for you. But we want to be able to use it because TypeScript has certain things that we want to know from a linting perspective. So we grabbed that from here, and then the other thing I'm going to grab from the package JSON here. Cool. I'm going to grab this part of the scripts, which is right here. We're going to try this out and see what happens when we use tslint. So for now, at least at this point, instead of using the built-in Vue CLI service lint, we're going to try this out just to see what TypeScript lint will tell us. Okay, so we grabbed this line from package.json. Going to go here and replace that in our scripts in package.json. Cool. And now let's see what we get. Cool. So we get some warnings here, and these are definitely useful. We have some information about magic numbers, and then this shadowed name is something that took me a while to figure out, but basically these could sort of potentially refer to the same thing, and so if they're in the same scope, it wants you to rename. Okay, that feature right there is something that I would point out as an extremely useful aspect of TypeScript, which is that when you hover, so in the same way that you can do F12 on a method, you can do, at least in TypeScript files, in pure TypeScript files, you can do an automatic rename, which is incredibly useful. So I think for me, I have it as Command R, but let's see, TypeScript rename, keyboard. Does anyone, I don't know if Command R plus R works for you, but I'll leave that aside for now. Just super useful for current state. An example of fixing some of the lint errors that they pointed out to us. And let's give it a shot to real quick try. So I'm going to delete hello world. Because that was one that they re-added. Let's just try in search bar to see what it does when we try this lang equals ts. Okay. Yeah. I want to check. I don't think it's related to any of this. I'll throw it out here. Anyone, if you do this lang equals ts in search bar.vue, are you seeing the same exact issue? No. Okay. Well, then maybe it's a me thing. Yeah. Do you want me to try disabling? Let's give it a shot. That looks good. Okay, so other people were seeing no errors here, hopefully? What? Interesting. Okay. Works on my machine situation. So let's try this one more time to make sure that we're still able to compile things and have a working application that we can start adding things to. Okay, so we definitely get some errors here. Ooh, these are fun and useful. Cool. Yeah, these are really excellent and potentially very helpful error messages. All of these should still allow us to compile successfully. Okay, sweet. All right, so the error messages that we're seeing here were because now this search bar.vue is a language TypeScript. It's starting to be able to catch some of these things where things are not defined in the way that it's expecting them to be defined. We can fix this. Let's first, I'm gonna I'm gonna, because the app is now running, I would commit these changes, and because I've compared the before and the after, and I've seen that things are working. So convert to cool. All right. So why is does everyone has search bar.vue converted over to TypeScript? Cool. Why is it yelling at us here? There are lots of things that Vue can successfully, with its TypeScript annotations, can successfully know about your code. But there are some things, because the way that a Vue instance is initialized is kind of crazy. There's lots of some circular references that, for example, everything is just a property on an object. Oh! And I forgot a very key thing, which I'm glad I was able to roughly remember. We mentioned in home.vue, we mentioned that we now have this syntax. And this is a key part of what allows TypeScript to infer types, because it has to have this extend method. And that's something that I was missing here. So I'm going to default extend. You end up ending. So now it's a method here. And then also, this is going to be an error right now, because I need to import Vue. So I just grabbed that code from over in home.vue, which was the one that was auto-converted. So I'm going to grab now import Vue from Vue. Cool. Okay. So this should give us a little bit more in terms of being able to infer some of these types. So what's this first one? So I'm just going to kind of work my way through right now, and try to understand a little bit about what each of these error messages, where I might be able to add type annotations to help clear up some of these things. So let me first, I'm going to try reopening that. Okay. Let's try the first part, which is that if we remember an interface, right now in data, I think we need to explain to Vue what data will be returning. And so we do this in the typical TypeScript approach here of return a type. And in this case, we're going to do an interface. So I'm going to say interface, and I'm going to essentially just copy this over. So export interface is search bar data. Cool. And I want to breeze through this a little bit, but I will certainly get back to this, or certainly explain here. Apologies. This is the downside of live coding. Let's see what we've got here. Okay. Okay. Oh.
Remove the comma after the input comma.
Oh, we should be good, I think, actually, with all of these removed. It's tough because I don't have the format on save. So often this will be less of an issue when you're working on saving code, because it'll auto format and strip those commas for you. I think actually the message that I saw was this states thing is incorrectly typed, because the actual type of states is this array that I'm importing from over here, where each state looks like this rather than an array of strings. So let's try this real quick. I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I'll move past it if I'll move past it if we get too stuck on here. But what I'm saying is that a single state takes this shape, and then I mentioned that for an array type in TypeScript, it can be an array of strings, but in this case, I just want an array of states. Okay, so that should have finally helped us ease up on this. Now, the actual return type of data is going to match what we've told it to expect with our interface. I'm a little worried about whether this will actually clear up some of the issues here, but let me do some things real quick. If this actually fixes the issue, then I will explain what's going on here.
Does this need some way to figure out that these data props they exist on the class construct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I was doing that, I couldn't figure it out, so I just switched it with the class.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Obviously, that is certainly one of the options. I will, I'll switch over. What if I just do any here? Oops. I will switch over to a working project if it actually, if it absolutely comes to that. But there are certain cases where Vue is not able to successfully infer things based on what you give it, and you have to add type annotations in those cases to help it know exactly what you're saying, like what's available on the method. I think at this point, so what I was doing here is telling Vue, okay, for this method, this is the type that it's returning, and essentially, in most cases, until you get to a point where Vue can interpret the entire component, it will often have issues recognizing anything that exists on the component instance. Let's try, before I switch over to a working project to give an example of that, let me try real quick on one of our simpler components. We're going to go back to home.vue, which had almost no information here. And I just want to see for so if I have data and cool. And now I have my computed. If I want to test, I want to test a computed prop. I have to, and I'm going to return something. I'm going to return this dot sum. I have to tell it what I'm returning. Okay, so, yeesh. I will, yeah. I'll explain what's going on here. We have the basic properties that are available on a Vue instance, and one of those sets of properties is computed. So what are our computed properties? This is a case where with the circular references that Vue has, it's not able to determine the return type of a computed property until you tell it. So it's not able to infer in this case, and we have to tell it, okay, you have to return a string. When we're typing now, VS Code has access to what is the Vue instance and what are the available properties on it. In this case, this dot, we have our private methods and properties that are available on a Vue instance that we're used to with refs and listeners and emit. And then we also have this one that we just created, sum. Cool. We also know that Vue can keep track of what is sum going to be. And in this case, it needs to be a string because that's what the data property is. It's a string. When this is going to be useful, and I'm a little worried that it's going to be tough to get to this point because of the blocks over here on search bar, which I apologize for. Where this is going to be useful is when we start to have methods that pass information from component to component. And let's, I guess, real quick, give that a shot by seeing if we can add the types to this search component. We'll see what happens. And that, because what we want to do is the biggest thing in this app that we're about to, that would be useful here is to be able to tell each component that's going to be referencing cities, we want to be able to tell it what type that property is going to be so that you can automatically get access to the properties on a city. So let's try once more with, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep that over there, but I'm going to revert these changes on search bar because I think it's currently going to cause more issues than it's worth. Let's try over here on search. So we have our import Vue from Vue. We have our export default Vue.extend. And then this is where we would expect to start potentially seeing issues if it can't successfully interpret. What's going on here with lang equals ts? These are going to be .vue, but yeah, it looks like later down in this component. What do we got here? Okay, but these are generally more useful error messages. For example, it knows that this .cities exists on the component here. And it knows something about this type, which is obviously incorrect at the moment. Okay, so I have slightly more optimism that this component is correctly configured. So if you'll stick with me we'll do another 5 minutes here to at least get this property implemented, and then I'd love to obviously take questions and, most importantly, hopefully be able to point you in the end to working repositories that we can reference. So we have this city's property, we have this city's data, and it's passed to the search bar and the search result chart. And both of them know nothing about the shape of that property that they're consuming. So we want to give them information about the shape of that. So we're going to create an interface, which will eventually be exported. we are going to, for now we'll just create the interface here. Interface city should be enough. And we know that this is roughly the shape of it. So, and I also happen to know that it's going to have an optional state. Okay, so the interface for city slug is going to be a string. Name is also going to be a string. The GHG is the greenhouse gases that we've got that we're keeping track of, and we know this is going to be a number or null. Both are valid here, and state is going to be a type of string. Now, what we can do here, TypeScript, and this is something that I think is there are different ways to annotate this data and say what we're expecting here. But one such way is to do as, and that is saying TypeScript, this thing that currently doesn't have a type because it's an empty array, I want you to know that it's going to be, or the type that I expect it to be, is an array of cities. And I don't know if you saw, but we had, actually I can undo here, we have all these errors down here that are related to TypeScript not being able to know the type of cities. But as soon as we tell it what's going on here, so we've defined our city interface, and we now know that cities is this array. Each time that something is happening in cities, it knows city.slug needs to be a string. And this is where we start to see really useful things. If I had tried to assign this something like 45, we're going to get an issue and a helpful error message because can't compare types string and number. This is also the case where we start to make good use of the function the F12, because I want to see, okay, where is city slug defined, and I get navigated straight to the interface that defines the city object. Okay, given that that worked, we can try for the last step, which is then in the child component, which is going to get past this property. How do we access information about the property in a type-safe way? So what I'm going to do in order to, a pattern that we found works well for us at Politico, is when we have types that we want to export to be used elsewhere, we're going to do a quick new file here. We're going to do search .types. Types is just a helper word for us, but we're going to make a Typescript file just to say this is where we're going to keep the types for this. We're going to remove it from here, and we should probably get some errors here because now we don't know what city is. Cool. So we have this types file. We're going to export it, and in now we can use this type in multiple different places. So first we're going to use it from here. Can do a quick search.types, and we get a little bit of autocomplete help there as well, because Viter and VS Code can know what files are available, and we should then get autocomplete here. Yep, cool. It knows what exported interfaces are there. And now we're back to no errors here because city is imported. Cool, so we've imported it in search.view, and we know that search result chart also has this as a prop. It has this array of cities that it's expecting. Right now, all we know is that this is an array, and we know nothing about the types that are available on those cities. We should be able to hopefully do this if we can overcome any of the issues we faced in the search bar. If you can't tell, my confidence in this working is shot, but I think that's a common thing when you start transitioning a project over. So we've got our view.extend now on search result chart, and the last step here, TypeScript, and make this one a .view, Now we should find out what TypeScript is still mad at us about. Hey, cool, okay. We've got most things working here. We haven't had to add many annotations for TypeScript to know what's going on in this component. And in order for, so we're going to import, we're going to import that interface that we just created, search.types, and we'll get it here. Cool, we've got it imported. This is one of the weirder syntaxes that's required to make TypeScript work with props, and I'll make sure I'm going to be adding some notes, obviously in the Discord channel, and then hopefully making some comments on the PR of places to pay attention to. This is a format that will hopefully be pretty useful for you in the future, where you can use this as, and this is saying as kind of like the result of a method, but just the way to type this property is this format. And we're going to say, so that tells us that cities is going to be this type of a city array. Let's see if adding annotations here is sufficient to help us get past those issues. Okay. Oh, number null. Ah, nice. Okay. So the last, I think the last thing I'll say at this point, the error I'm getting here is actually useful to me, because when I created, so we're saying argument of type number null is not assignable to parameter of type number. The last bit of audience participation, how many of you have had undefined is not a function in the browser? Maybe some hands. That's probably one of the most common JavaScript problems. It shows up in every JavaScript t-shirt or whatever, because it's so common to not be thinking about whether the value that we're potentially trying to access is null or is undefined. And that's something that's been super useful for us, is when we accurately type our our code to make sure that it actually exists, and say, okay, I know that in this case, like I did here, I know that in this case for GHG there could be a time where GHG is null, and so I want to make sure that I'm thinking about that in my code. Meaning, essentially, what I got here is a bug, because there's a chance that these GHG values are null, and it's something I wasn't thinking about. So I'm going to, if GHG values, and TypeScript is smart enough to recognize this, I'm going to say does not equal null, because that's my favorite existence check, but you can do however you would like to do this. And let me do spread GHG. I'm worried that ish. Let's we'll go with that for now. This is, I would say, a code smell, probably, is what I did here, because I'm saying, okay, it's an array of numbers in this case, but realistically, I think this is worth it to do, of accurately check for existence, because when we're using this as, TypeScript approach, it's saying what TypeScript thinks this value is based on everything it knows about your code. It's going to throw an issue, and I think it's accurately throwing an issue there because GHG could be null. And so this is a code smell that I need to come back here and actually think about this existence check, so I don't get the undefined is not a function. And then this last step, let's also do the same. Same hacky approach here. Where I'm gonna say each is a number, but obviously this is worth it to do. So what did we get with all of that? That was a lot of work, or at least a lot of setup because things were difficult initially. What we got is that now this city's clone, I know what type it is, and if I want to access something about it, so city's clone, and I'm going to access just the first element in the array, and TypeScript is smart enough to know what's on that. Here are the things that are on that, and here are the potential types of them. And if I'm ever interested in setting one of them, I can set that thing, but I can't set it to a number because TypeScript knows that that has to be a type. If I want to access it, same thing. If I want to modify it or use it in a function, which there are definitely cases where we're doing, for example, this calculation, it's expecting this city, but right now it's an any because I haven't yet done the process, which we can do super quickly, of saying, hey, I know I've created an interface, I know what the type this is now, and I'm gonna components. I know that this thing has to be a type of city when you're trying to pass it. When you're trying to pass me any information. And look, I've got the same. This time I can actually do an accurate existence check. So I can say if city.ghg does not equal null, and there we go. Otherwise, we'll just return 0 for now. TypeScript can be looking at my code and say, hey, you successfully checked to make sure this isn't null. So in this case, we know that this is going to be a safe access. That's as far as I want to go right now, and I realize that things were a little scattered there, and so I know that's probably a little tough to follow along and make those changes, but I'm hopeful that in having this, I'll merge in these changes and add some comments of things to be aware of. And I'm hopeful that in having the repo yourself, as long as was everyone at a point where they did the add and they were able to build or see something served? Was that good? Cool. So then what I would encourage as practice going forward is for each of the existing components, work on the lang equals ts and follow the existing guidelines here for adding types to things if you see view errors, and then practice in things that you see wherever you see something that TypeScript is not able to recognize. The biggest, easiest way to do that is to turn this back on, so no implicit any. You'll start to see a lot of those errors, and you can start addressing, okay, these are cases where I am not writing fully type safe TypeScript yet, and I can improve that by using interfaces or using type annotations. And you can catch bugs in your code like me live coding. Okay, so a little scattered. Yeah, Tracy.
I have a question for you.
Please.
Okay, so maybe I missed this because I was actually fixing a production bug when you started talking.
Nice.
But like, what are you doing? Are you actually going back and using TypeScript on existing projects, or are you just going forward and using TypeScript on the new project? Because it could be really, like a big project could be really quite a chore.
Yeah.
So like, So I always make sure everything has 100% test coverage on the 3 layers. So
Mhm.
that wouldn't be a concern for me.
Yeah.
Breaking anything, because I would be sure of that.
Yeah.
But like, it just seems like it could be a really daunting task.
Yeah. We've only fully implemented it on, it's not in production yet, but on, production track on one project.
Okay.
Um,
Was it retro? Did you go back?
No, it was brand new. However, we also have had some success in incrementally adopting it in our shared component library, which was a plain Vue JavaScript application. So created with the CLI, but started with JavaScript, and it has a lot of code that's just JavaScript. And we've been able to successfully at least test out making individual component files TypeScript. You'll notice that the good news about this, despite all these errors, is that it is possible to do this incrementally, and I think that's one of the bigger selling points, even though there's some initial hurdles to probably get linting working and get building compiling. But you can leave your other components as just a standard script tag, and you can just apply it to this component, say, I'm ready to add types for this. I'm ready to create interfaces or make sure that methods are returning the correct things. So it'd be great in a well-tested scenario. You wouldn't have to worry about it there. But the really nice thing about TypeScript, I'd argue, is that even if in a not well-tested scenario, if it compiles, it's definitely not guaranteed. It's still like you're still outputting JavaScript. It's not like I've never used Elm, but the selling point of Elm is that if it compiles, you're never going to have a runtime error, which is insane for something that runs in the browser. But basically, if you get a runtime error in the browser, you file a bug with Elm because something's wrong with Elm. So it's not like that, but it does mean that if it compiles without errors, that you've successfully applied types in places that you have TypeScript enabled. So I think it's doable, and we're doing it a little bit, but not on any of our huge projects.
Few pieces of features that are really complex that just could possibly be able to have it strictly type or Java.
Yeah.
Too, so.
Something that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
When you start writing interfaces, I start having nightmares. But anyway.
Yeah, go for it.
How does TypeScript protect you from data coming back from Axios? How do you?
Yeah, also a really good question. 2 parts. One, the first is that you still have the same concerns that a REST endpoint is a REST endpoint controlled by the backend, and I don't get to say what that sends me back, but I do get to say what I'm expecting to get back. And so the first option, and probably the next step that we would have taken here, is for my Axios endpoint, which I have in this API.index. Or index.ts, instead of just having fetch energy usage by city and state with untyped parameters. Note that these are now red underlined because I've re-enabled this implicit anything. So I've re-enabled that. Instead of this, I would say these are the parameters it has to be, and also the promise that I'm returning, here's the type that it's going to be. And as well as I can know it at the time that I write the code, I'll write my interface of what I'm expecting. And then you have the same issue where if your backend says, oh, I'm going to remove 3 properties, like you'll still have that issue. Something that I will add as links and that has been just incredible for how well it solves that problem is something called Swagger Code Gen. So Swagger or OpenAPI is a spec that can be implemented for APIs, for RESTful APIs. I'll post this in the link. If your backend or if you want to help your backend people implement it, if they decide to add, often it's documentation comments, depending on what language they're using for their backend. But if they decide to implement that spec for the backend, it will output a schema that you can then generate an entire API client in TypeScript, and you can run it against the spec, meaning that when we update our projects, we have 4 different sets of APIs that all have a Swagger schema. We can point at those and say, go generate TypeScript clients for these, and it's guaranteed at that point in a way that's still decoupled, which is really cool. It's guaranteed that that's going to be the shape of the API, both what it's expecting and the responses.
Do you get a runtime error if your response is not compliant to the interface you just wrote?
No, No. You it's useful to still add. You will get a runtime error if you, in the same way that that you would get it in JavaScript if previously this property was there and no longer the API is no longer providing it. So you'll get that same type of runtime error. TypeScript really doesn't affect the type of runtime errors that you get, so that's, I think, a valid issue or a valid point. But I really like this code gen process because you keep your front end and your back end in sync, while at the same time being able to abstract away like whatever you want. You could totally switch your back end, and it's just this generated client that you have. And so then I just write like legislators API dot, and I see all the available methods and what the response types are.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Hey, Brian.
What's your personal style for implementing TypeScript between preemptive and reactive, and why?
Are you thinking as I go and write brand new code, and like whether I'm going to say each time I have like a constant, whether I'm going to type that thing, or what is it useful to like, is it most?
Where do you far in your, I guess maybe another way to put it is, how eager are you to add TypeScript to things prior to having a specific reason in that code right there as to here is how TypeScript solves the real problem that we actually have right now, versus I like to put it in ahead of time for a number of reasons.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would avoid adding it if you, I would avoid starting with it if you expect your project to be small and or the number of people contributing to be limited, and the complexity of the way different files and components interact to be somewhat limited. And in that case, the stuff we did right now, it was great for it helped me catch a couple bugs, but it's a smallish project that is probably comprehensible without the addition of this self-documenting code, and unlikely to have a ton of bugs that come from forgetting what each method or what each constant is expecting. But I would be preemptive in the case of the project that we used it on, when we had specific potential issues in mind, which was on the most recent project that team had worked on. They had gotten a ton of type and existence errors. The undefined is not a function, and we're forgetting to check for that, or it was happening in unexpected places, like in the response from an API. And having TypeScript yell at us when we're not thinking of that has been extremely useful. And then my argument that I would put forward for any time it's a larger team size is I think it really helps onboarding and writing maintainable and understandable and like well-documented code for everyone on the team. So if it's going to be a large project, a large potential number of people working on it, and large in potential complexity, whether it's file size or lots of different things interacting, then my personal opinion would be to be preemptive, because then you write type-safe code from the beginning and you get in good habits, I think. I think it's also a valid or valuable approach to start thinking about it adding after the fact. If you're like, we really don't know what's going on in this set of files, we might want to start considering adding TypeScript there. Yeah?
Do you get any of that TypeScript when you're using your variables inside the template?
No. And that was my number 2 frustration. Number 1 is that the renaming that I showed you, which if you're writing a pure TypeScript app, which it's tough to imagine exactly what that would look like because you're always going to be interacting with HTML in some way. But say it's pure TypeScript on the back end. You just have a bunch of TypeScript files. Anytime I rename something, it'll rename across every file it's possibly imported in, which is great. You just never have to think about it, and it's awesome. Really, really good for refactoring. I think that's another thing that I find it useful for. So you can't do that in Vue files because that's something that Viter hasn't implemented yet. So that's my number 1 complaint. And then my number 2 complaint is that you don't get the type safety when you're writing in templates. And so that has affected our coding style a little bit, I'd say in a neutral way, maybe a good way, in that any of our methods that have any sort of complexity to them, more than just like does not exist, like that's pretty much it that we throw in the template. Otherwise, we'll create a computed for that. Because that'll really limit the amount of typos that you expose yourself to by having things in the template. And the other thing is just VS Code is good in general about paying attention to the things you've typed in your file before. You get that with JavaScript. So some of your like autocomplete is just like, what other words have you typed in this file? Do you want to autocomplete with that thing? So you still get that in the template, but you don't get the type safety in the template. If anyone knows how to write VS Code extensions or language services, it's planned for Viter. To have a Vue language service, which is what would allow that to say like, I'm in the template and I also know the context of my TypeScript. Here's what you're allowed to type. Angular has that for VS Code. So it's doable and it's planned, but there's no arrival date for it. So those would be my two biggest complaints right now. And we've still found it to be really worth it.
So I'm wondering, because so the last project I worked on before JavaScript was Java, and of course we use IDEs. TypeScript kind of sort of go into more like active language. I mean, would it be, maybe is there an IDE would work better in? I'm just wondering.
Not better. I think because VS Code was designed both in TypeScript and in some ways for it, and because TypeScript was first meant as a front-end language, realistically, I think the reason to write TypeScript on your backend is to be writing the same language, right? Or you like the.
I think of like first service or whatever. But
Yeah. Visual Studio obviously would work with TypeScript, but Visual Studio has always been more of a .NET thing, and so Visual Studio Code I think is definitely still the best choice, and it's nice in some ways that it's a more lightweight, not full IDE. Yeah, but that is definitely the direction it's going, and the code navigation. So renaming doesn't work in files, but the fact that code navigation works, and I can go. Which one did we have it in search, right? We have this working. So the fact that I can do that on anything and just be taken to where it's defined, and I can also see Shift F12 everywhere that it's used, is just really, really great.
Yeah, I mean, it really turned into an IDE.
Yeah. I don't know what they call VS Code anymore, but
It's still text editor technically.
yeah. Any other questions? Thank you. Oh yeah.
Sorry, one last one. Do you have a preference between using class-based with TypeScript decorators or the other way? So why?
Yeah. Would what we just did be the other way, or? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I have not done any full project with classes, but that would actually probably be my preference, because there are some things at my last place I was doing, we were Angular 2 and 4 and 5 or whatever. There are a few things that I really miss from that in terms of code readability and self-documenting code, because classes have in JavaScript, you can have a class, but you don't have the concept of private and public methods, which is something that's really important to object-oriented program. Again, not computer science background, but from my understanding of that process, and it's something we made really, I think, good use of, which is that every time you have a method that's longer than 4 lines or whatever, you should break that up and say exactly what those 3 lines are doing, so that you can self-document rather than commenting your code. Classes with public and private methods are really, really good for that. Whereas in Vue, I think that's something I've been slightly frustrated with, is the way it's written. There's no difference between this like super niche method that I've written in the component and the one that actually gets used from the template. So that's something I like about classes. As far as the experience and finding things that just work for TypeScript with Vue, I think they're close to equal. So we didn't get to API and we didn't get to Vuex, which is a major thing, and I apologize for that because I would have liked to get to it. But I will link the resources and examples of how to do that. You definitely, in order to make Vuex work with TypeScript, you definitely need an extra package. And for what we were going to do, it's called Vuex TypeScript. So it can make it work with object syntax, and then for the class one, there's decorators that you can include with your Vuex methods. So that's one of the last things I would leave you with. Vuex with TypeScript is mildly frustrating, but you can do it, and you can do it in a very consistent and workable way. I would warn you, it adds some extra code to get type safety with Vuex. So it won't be as simple as map getters. Instead, you'll have a line for each individual getter function that you'll call, because map getters is a string, and that's why you can't make it type safe. So yeah, apologies for that. But I'll link the resources, and I do want everyone to know that it is doable.
Got everybody.